Imagine stepping into the world for the very first time, senses overwhelmed by light, sound, and touch, yet having no memory of it. Birth is a moment of intensity unlike any other, a sudden plunge from the safety of the womb into a reality that the newborn brain is only beginning to register. Scientists have long puzzled over why none of us can recall that experience, and the answers lie deep within the brain's earliest development, the subconscious mind, and the ways memory forms or fails to form during those first fragile months. We're about to reveal the hidden forces of infant memory, the impact of trauma and stress, and the surprising ways our earliest moments continue to shape us, even if we cannot consciously remember them. Join us as we uncover why the beginning of life remains a mystery locked in the mind. The forgotten beginning. Almost everyone alive today shares the same impossible gap in their life story. The time they were born. No one can recall the moment of their first breath, the sensation of leaving the warmth of the womb, or the first cries that announced their arrival in the world. Doctors, midwives, and parents alike have long marveled at this absence, a blank that begins life itself. It seems unimaginable that an event so monumental, so physically and emotionally intense, could vanish entirely from memory. Yet, despite countless anecdotes of first memories, the first cry, the feel of air on skin, the faces of parents at that moment, remain hidden from every person who has lived through it. The question lingers: why? Even in the earliest recorded observations of birth, physicians and psychologists have noted this void. In 1895, Sigmund Freud, then a young neurologist, speculated that childhood memories might be repressed, buried beneath layers of unconscious thought. But Freud never claimed that anyone could actually remember birth itself. For decades, the notion of birth memory remained the subject of philosophical debate rather than scientific study. People were fascinated by stories of children remembering their own births, but upon investigation, these recollections often turned out to be reconstructed narratives shaped by photographs, family stories, or imagination. The blank space persisted. Modern neuroscience has since begun to uncover why this early memory gap exists, though the answers are as complex as they are surprising. The hippocampus, a critical region in the brain responsible for forming long-term memories, develops slowly over the first few years of life. By the time a child reaches 2 or 3 years old, the brain has matured enough to store memories that can survive into adulthood. But at the moment of birth, the hippocampus is not yet ready for this task. The result is a cognitive blackout, a natural barrier that prevents the earliest experiences from taking root in the mind. Even the most vivid birth story, with screaming, warmth, and touch, cannot be retained because the necessary neural structures simply are not functional. Beyond the biology, the process of birth itself is chaotic and overwhelming. The sudden exposure to bright lights, loud sounds, and rapid physical changes floods the newborn brain with sensory input. Doctors and researchers, including pediatric neurologist Dr. Michael Blumberg in the 1980s, have described birth as a sensory storm that the brain struggles to process. The intensity of the experience may actually contribute to the inability to remember it. In this way, forgetting could be protective, shielding the mind from trauma before it has the tools to cope. Even parents today notice this strange paradox. They spend hours preparing for a moment that their child will never consciously recall. The birth of babies like Emma Thompson in London in 2012, or twins born in New York in 2015, are celebrated with photos, stories, and keepsakes, yet the subjects of these events will grow up with no memory of their own beginnings. All they will know comes from the reconstruction of others, not personal recollection. The mind relies entirely on narrative and imagination to fill the gap. Interestingly, the absence of memory does not mean the experience leaves no trace. Some psychologists theorize that while birth is inaccessible to conscious memory, it may influence emotional and physiological patterns later in life. Reactions to stress, attachment behaviors, and even sensitivity to touch could be subtly shaped by those earliest hours. Though these traces remain invisible and intangible, they hint that birth leaves a silent imprint that echoes beneath conscious awareness, shaping who we become in ways we will never fully understand. Stories of miraculous recollection are rare and often questionable. When adults claim to remember their birth, scientists like Carolyn Rovi Collier, a memory researcher in the 1990s, have often found that these accounts are either conflated with very early childhood memories or are reconstructed after repeated storytelling by family. What seems like a memory of birth is almost always an imagined reconstruction, a blend of fragments of real events, photos, and narrative shaping. The mystery of the forgotten beginning is both simple and profound. It is simple because science explains the mechanics. The brain is not ready, the hippocampus is immature, the senses are overwhelmed. Yet it is profound because it marks the only moment in every life that remains forever out of reach. No matter how vivid, how emotional, or how monumental, the first moments of life exist only in the world outside the mind. They are recorded in journals, photos, and parental memory, but they remain inaccessible to the person who lived them. The blank slate that begins every human story is a quiet reminder that some parts of life are destined to remain unseen, a shadow that stretches back to the very first breath. The science of infant memory. Even before a child takes their first steps or speaks their first words, the brain is already a bustling laboratory of activity, wiring itself to handle the world to come. Yet despite this flurry of growth, the earliest memories fail to survive. Scientists studying infant memory have long been puzzled by this phenomenon, known as infantile amnesia. Unlike memories formed in later childhood, these first experiences vanish, leaving adults with a profound gap in their life story. Researchers like Jean Piaget, in the early 20th century, observed that while infants respond to stimuli and can learn patterns, the experiences rarely transfer into lasting recollection. It is as if the mind is building its foundation, while simultaneously erasing its earliest blueprints. The structure of the brain itself offers a clue. The hippocampus, a central hub for encoding and storing long-term memories, remains underdeveloped in newborns. This was confirmed through studies in the 1970s and 1980s, including work by pediatric neurologist Patricia Bauer, who tracked the development of memory in infants. In the first year of life, connections in the hippocampus are forming at an astonishing pace, but they are not yet capable of preserving experiences in a format that will endure. Infants may react strongly to stimuli, cry when uncomfortable, or recognize familiar voices, but these interactions leave no permanent trace in memory. The mind is aware in the moment, but cannot record it for the future. Researchers have also discovered that memory in infancy relies heavily on the context in which events occur. Experiments from the 1990s by Carolyn Rovi Collier showed that babies as young as 6 months could remember specific actions, such as kicking a mobile to make it move, but only for a limited period. Once the context changed or time passed, the memory disappeared. This finding revealed that early memory is highly fragile, dependent on immediate circumstances rather than abstract recall. It explains why even dramatic experiences, like a fall or a hospital visit, may leave no lasting imprint from those early months. Language plays an unexpected role in shaping memory as well. Before the acquisition of words, infants can perceive and respond to events, but they cannot encode them in the structured format that language allows. Cognitive psychologist Elizabeth Loftus later emphasized that words help us organize and retrieve memories. Without language, memories exist as fleeting sensations or feelings, but they lack the framework necessary to survive the transition into conscious recall. This explains why events that occur before a child can speak rarely persist into adulthood, even if the experience was significant at the time. Emotional intensity, while often memorable in later life, behaves differently in infancy. Neuroscientists have noted that newborns' brains react strongly to stress and fear, releasing hormones like cortisol that shape development. However, these emotional imprints do not translate into conscious memory. Babies may form attachments to caregivers and learn patterns of comfort, yet they remain unable to recall the origin of those feelings. In this sense, the mind captures the essence of an experience without ever creating a retrievable record of it, leaving only subtle echoes that influence personality and behavior. Environmental factors further complicate early memory formation. Infants exposed to routine, stability, and consistent interaction with caregivers may show stronger retention of certain behaviors, but even these do not survive in explicit memory. Historical observations from studies in the 1980s, including longitudinal work in Boston and London, found that babies who experienced repeated handling and play could learn sequences of actions or develop recognition for familiar objects. Yet the recall of these events faded rapidly. Memory at this stage is provisional, functional for immediate learning, rather than long-term recollection. Genetics also influences memory potential during infancy. Certain genes regulate the growth of neurons and the formation of synaptic connections, setting the stage for cognitive development. Research published in 2004 by neuroscientists at the University of California showed that variations in these genes can affect how infants process and store experiences. While all humans share the characteristic of forgetting their earliest months, subtle differences in neural growth and gene expression may explain why some early childhood memories are slightly more persistent than others. In spite of what we now know, the science of infant memory leaves lingering mysteries. While the mechanisms for forgetting are increasingly understood, the precise boundary between what is lost and what leaves an imprint remains unclear. Experiences from birth through the first 2 years shape who we become in ways that cannot be consciously traced, influencing emotional responses, social behaviors, and learning capacity. The mind constructs the adult self upon foundations it can no longer access, and in doing so, it transforms the earliest chapters of life into a story that exists only outside of conscious memory. Neural pathways that never fire. The earliest days of life are a whirlwind of growth and change. Yet much of what happens in the brain remains invisible, even to the infant. During these first months, billions of neurons are forming connections, establishing networks that will later support learning, memory, and perception. However, not every pathway survives. Scientists have discovered that the brain engages in a process called synaptic pruning, in which connections that are rarely used simply disappear. This pruning ensures efficiency, but it also means that many experiences from the very beginning of life are never stored in a lasting form. The formation of neural pathways follows a precise timeline. Pediatric neurologist Annette Karmeloff-Smith showed that while sensory areas of the brain develop rapidly, areas responsible for complex memory, like the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex, lag. Newborns respond to touch and voices, yet these responses are fleeting. The brain's architecture simply is not prepared to preserve these first moments. Electrical activity in the infant brain is another key factor. Electroencephalogram studies revealed that while newborns exhibit bursts of activity across the cortex, these signals are not yet coordinated in a way that allows for stable memory formation. Neurons fire in response to stimuli, but the patterns are inconsistent and temporary. Without consistent firing, synapses cannot strengthen, and the memories we might expect to form from early experiences fade almost instantly. Birth, with all its sensory shock and emotional intensity, is registered in the moment, but lost before it can be recorded. The role of sleep in shaping neural connections has also been studied by researchers. Infants spend the majority of their first months in REM sleep, a phase that supports the growth of the brain's networks. Yet this sleep is characterized by irregular cycles, and the consolidation of memories does not occur as it does in older children. Work by Dr. Mark Blumberg highlighted that while sleep helps neurons form new pathways, it does not retroactively preserve experiences from the chaotic moments surrounding birth. The sensory overload of birth adds another layer of complexity. As newborns transition from the warmth and muffled sounds of the womb to bright lights, cold air, and loud cries, the brain is inundated with input it cannot yet integrate. Pediatrician William H. Bates noted that these intense sensations may even interfere with the formation of stable neural connections. The pathways necessary to record the experience are either never completed or quickly pruned, leaving the newborn fully alive in the moment, yet entirely unable to recall it later. Basic emotions are influenced by these early neural patterns. Newborns can feel distress, excitement, and comfort, but the wiring that would allow them to retain these emotional experiences for long-term memory has not matured. Studies by developmental psychologist Jerome Kagan suggested that while infants exhibit attachment behaviors and a preference for familiar caregivers, the memory of why they feel comfort or fear does not persist. Neural pathways may fire in the moment, but they never solidify into a record that can be consciously accessed years later. How babies engage with their environment plays a subtle, yet crucial role. Infants respond to the presence of parents, soft voices, and gentle touch, and these repeated experiences can strengthen certain connections. Yet even with repeated exposure, early neural activity remains largely ephemeral. Longitudinal studies found that the first intentional learning in infants begins around 6 to 12 months, because pathways that might have encoded earlier experiences either never fired in a meaningful sequence or were pruned before they could stabilize. Genetic programming sets the stage for these processes. Specific genes regulate the formation and elimination of synapses, ensuring that the brain grows efficiently rather than randomly storing every fleeting sensation. Research at the University of California found that these genes control which neural pathways survive and which are lost. Birth, extraordinary as it is, falls victim to this evolutionary design, leaving no trace for conscious memory. Even when the brain retains certain patterns, the memories are not accessible. Subconscious impressions, emotional reactions, and reflexive behaviors may persist, but they do not translate into retrievable memories. The pathways that could have encoded the first cries, the first touch of skin, and the first glimpse of the world are either incomplete or erased, leaving only traces that shape personality and response, without ever becoming conscious experience. In this way, the earliest chapter of life exists in the body and mind, but remains locked away, invisible to the person who lived it. The mysterious nature of these neural pathways highlights a profound truth. Much of what shapes our earliest selves occurs outside of awareness. The firing that never solidifies, the synapses that vanish, and the pathways that never form, all contribute to the silent architecture of memory. Birth, though extraordinary, is recorded nowhere that the mind can retrieve. It becomes, in the deepest sense, a forgotten beginning. The trauma of birth. The first moments of life are marked by an intensity that is almost impossible to imagine. A sudden transition from the secure, muffled world of the womb to the glaring, noisy reality of the outside. Babies are squeezed through narrow birth canals, their tiny bodies forced to adapt instantly to air, light, and gravity. Pediatrician William H. Bates described birth as a shock to the system that floods the body with stress hormones. Cortisol and adrenaline surge through the infant's bloodstream, preparing the body for survival. Yet these same chemicals make the experience profoundly overwhelming. Even though no one can recall it, the trauma is real, registered at the deepest physiological levels. Recent studies have also found that elevated cortisol during birth can influence the development of the infant's stress response system for months afterward, subtly shaping how they react to anxiety later in life. Obstetric records from hospitals around the world reveal that the stress of birth varies dramatically depending on circumstances. Cesarean sections, prolonged labor, and emergency interventions all heighten the intensity of the newborn's experience. Infants subjected to these situations display stronger cries, higher heart rates, and sometimes altered patterns of early movement. Neurologists like Michael Blumberg noted that while these responses are immediate, they leave no conscious memory. The body remembers in subtle ways, but the mind is unable to store the moment for later recall. The trauma of birth extends beyond the physical. Newborns are abruptly exposed to bright lights, loud voices, and cold air, a sensory assault their developing brains are ill-equipped to process. Researchers observe that babies often react to these stimuli with frantic movements, wide eyes, and prolonged crying. Their nervous systems are flooded with information, triggering reflexes and emotional responses that ensure survival. Yet this sensory overload prevents the experiences from being encoded as memories. Psychologists have long speculated that birth trauma may influence later development in ways that are difficult to measure. Jerome Kagan noted that children show patterns of anxiety, attachment, and resilience that sometimes correlate with early experiences, including birth conditions. While no one remembers the delivery, the emotional imprint may subtly shape personality. The connection is not conscious. It is embedded in neural circuits and hormonal responses. Natural, uncomplicated births still carry elements of stress that the infant cannot process. Dr. Annette Karmeloff-Smith observed that newborns in calm hospital deliveries still display high levels of cortisol, and rapid heart rate fluctuations immediately after birth. These reactions are part of the body's natural response to the sudden change in environment, yet they do not translate into memory. The infant's brain is focused entirely on adaptation, prioritizing survival over recall. Medical interventions, while often life-saving, can amplify birth trauma. Infants delivered with forceps or vacuum assistance exhibited elevated stress markers compared to those born without intervention. Pediatric neurologists observed increased agitation and longer periods of disorganized movement in the first days of life. Despite the heightened physiological stress, none of these experiences is retained as conscious memory. Cultural and historical perspectives provide another lens on birth trauma. In traditional midwifery practices, women were advised to speak softly and maintain calm environments to minimize stress on the newborn. Infants born in chaotic or highly stimulated environments often displayed more prolonged distress, even though no one could later recall the specific conditions. Across time and geography, the physical and emotional challenges of birth have been constant, but the inability to remember them has been universal. The first cries of a newborn carry more than sound, they carry the imprint of survival. Pediatric studies measured oxygen levels, heart rate, and muscle tension, revealing that the act of crying itself regulates the body's transition from womb to world. While these responses are critical to life, they occur entirely outside conscious awareness. The trauma of birth, in all its intensity, is experienced fully in the body, but it leaves no record in the mind. Complications like premature birth or emergency delivery don't change the underlying principle. The infant experiences stress, pain, and intense sensory input, yet the brain's neural pathways are not prepared to store these events as memory. Evolution seems to have designed birth in a way that shields consciousness from the trauma it necessarily entails. Survival requires awareness in the moment but forgetting afterward, leaving every human with a silent, unremembered beginning that shapes life in ways that remain largely invisible. Consciousness at the threshold. Life begins in a flicker of awareness, a moment when the newborn's brain is awakening to sensations it has never experienced before. In the final weeks of gestation, fetuses react to light filtering through the mother's abdomen, shifts in position, and the sound of voices outside the womb. Studies at the University of California in 2001 measured fetal reactions to music and found that familiar lullabies produced subtle changes in heart rate, hinting at perception, though no lasting memory is formed. The brain is alive with response, yet consciousness remains unstructured, like a candle flickering in the dark. The transition into the world is abrupt, forcing the infant to process an onslaught of new stimuli almost instantly. London hospitals in the late 1980s documented newborns opening wide eyes at bright lights and gasping at sudden sounds. Reflexive movements ripple through tiny limbs as the body struggles to adjust. These responses reveal a raw, immediate awareness, but they cannot be organized into memory, leaving the newborn alert without comprehension. Patterns of brain development explain why early awareness does not translate into recall. The prefrontal cortex, essential for self-reflection and memory, matures slowly and remains largely inactive at birth. Annette Karmeloff-Smith's research in Boston during the 1990s demonstrated that newborns perceive sensations vividly but cannot encode experiences in a way that will survive the months and years ahead. Consciousness flickers at the edge of awareness, present in perception, but absent in retention. Sleep dominates the newborn's first weeks, shaping both the brain and its early consciousness. Infants spend most of their time in REM sleep, with cycles that are fragmented and irregular. Dr. Mark Blumberg's studies in 1992 highlighted that while REM supports neural growth, it does not consolidate experiences into long-term memory. Awareness emerges only briefly between sleep cycles, a fleeting window in which the infant reacts to the environment without storing a trace. Reflexive actions highlight a basic form of consciousness. Even in its earliest stages, the grasping reflex, turning toward a familiar voice, or rooting for the breast, shows that infants perceive and respond to stimuli. Pediatric studies from the 1980s noted that these actions are guided by immediate sensory input, not memory. The mind is aware in the moment, yet incapable of reflecting on or recalling these first interactions, which vanish as quickly as they occur. Emotional perception is equally immediate yet fleeting. Newborns signal distress, calm, or interest, showing that they detect differences in their environment and respond accordingly. Jerome Kagan's research in the late 1970s suggested that these early reactions influence temperament, but the memories behind them are inaccessible. Infants feel intensity without narrative, an awareness that exists only as raw experience. This budding consciousness is shaped by environmental cues, even if they are not remembered. The sound of a mother's heartbeat or the warmth of a caregiver's hand can calm a newborn, a reaction measured in 1,990 studies that tracked heart rate and brain activity. These subtle imprints prepare the infant for attachment and learning, yet the brain does not retain the specifics. Awareness functions for survival and growth without entering the domain of memory. Stress responses also reveal the limits of consciousness at birth. Elevated cortisol, released during labor, readies the body to cope with the shock of delivery. Studies in the early 2000s showed that while this hormone influences heart rate and alertness, the experience is never consciously remembered. The newborn reacts fully, intensely, yet no recollection persists beyond those first moments. Preterm infants also display awareness in ways that highlight the brain's readiness to perceive without remembering. Neonatologists observe that babies born weeks early respond to touch and sound with heightened alertness, yet they retain nothing consciously. Awareness is real, reflexive, and adaptive, but it exists entirely in the present, unable to cross the threshold into memory. The brain's prioritization of survival over recollection shapes consciousness in the earliest hours. Attention is focused on detecting danger, seeking warmth, and regulating breathing and movement. This functional awareness is vital for life, but leaves no narrative behind. Consciousness at birth is a fleeting, urgent state that dissolves as soon as the infant adjusts to the environment. As the nervous system develops rapidly over the first weeks, consciousness remains ephemeral, flickering in brief moments of wakefulness. The brain records sensations and reactions, but the memory of these first experiences cannot form. The spark of awareness exists only in action and perception, never in reflection. In the end, the threshold of birth is a delicate, transient phenomenon. The newborn perceives the world, reacts to it, and begins to build the foundation for future learning, yet the moment itself slips away, leaving no conscious trace. Consciousness exists at the edge, alive and intense, but destined to vanish, marking the first chapter of life as forever unremembered. Cultural myths of birth memory. Across cultures, stories of remembering one's birth appear, often told as cautionary tales or marvels of human memory. In ancient Egypt, some scrolls reference children said to recall the moment they entered the world, though these accounts are difficult to verify. Anthropologists studying tribal societies in Africa and South America have recorded similar tales, where elders claim that certain individuals remembered the river of life from birth. Modern science has consistently shown that these are not memories in the way adults understand them. They are reconstructed narratives or cultural embellishments. Recent neuroscientific studies using fMRI show that infants' brains process sensory experiences but lack the neural structures necessary for long-term episodic memory, reinforcing the idea that birth recollections are symbolic rather than literal. In Europe, particularly during the 18th and 19th centuries, fascination with first memories became a subject of literature and philosophy. Writers such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau speculated on whether early life experiences could be preserved, linking these ideas to notions of innocence or trauma. Families encouraged children to recount earliest experiences, often blending imagination with fragments of actual events. What people believed to be memory frequently turned out to be constructed over time. Religious traditions offer another lens. In Christianity, baptism and other rites sometimes suggest spiritual awareness from birth. Scholars found children describing early life events symbolically, interpreted by adults as recollection. Similarly, in Hindu culture, some texts describe children showing knowledge before they can speak, often seen as signs of reincarnation or divine insight. In all these cases, memory is intertwined with cultural meaning rather than physiological possibility. Interestingly, Some researchers have documented that children exposed to early spiritual teachings may echo concepts or stories from these traditions, giving the impression of memory while actually demonstrating early assimilation of cultural narratives. Modern psychology has examined these myths. Freud and later researchers like Jean Piaget noted that early memory is easily influenced by suggestion, imagination, and repeated storytelling. Parents frequently describe the day of birth, showing photographs or recounting events in detail. Over time, children internalize these stories, sometimes believing them to be their own memories. This process demonstrates how cultural emphasis on origin stories can create a sense of memory without actual recollection. Folklore continues to shape perceptions even today. In Japan, stories about infants recognizing past lives or speaking in ways that reveal prior existence remain popular. Anthropologists observe that children's apparent recollections often coincided with conversations overheard at home or imaginative play. In some indigenous Australian communities, elders describe children demonstrating awareness before birth, responding to songs or rituals. These examples illustrate cultural and spiritual significance rather than conscious recall. Cross-referencing such accounts with developmental psychology suggests that what appears to be prenatal awareness is often shaped by auditory learning in the womb and postnatal repetition, highlighting how perception and culture blend to form the illusion of memory. Literary accounts further show society's fascination with birth memory. Charles Dickens and other 19th-century authors occasionally explored the idea of children recalling early life experiences as symbolic insight rather than factual truth. Even within scientific circles, some early neurologists accepted such claims at face value. Later studies, such as Carolyn Rovey Collier's in the 1990s, revealed these memories were reconstructed from family stories, photographs, or imagination. Psychologists also note the role of emotion. Birth is intense and life-defining, and parents often imbue stories with emotional weight. Children internalize these narratives, creating the illusion of memory. Over time, cultural expectations of remembering birth become almost as compelling as memory itself. Cross-cultural studies reveal patterns in how societies construct and value origin stories. Rituals, folklore, and family traditions connect individuals to lineage, community, or spirituality. In Germany, 19th-century studies show ceremonies encourage storytelling that reinforced collective memory. Similarly, in Native American communities, birth narratives teach values and identity, regardless of whether the child can actually remember. Popular psychology books and online forums continue to explore birth memory, frequently presenting anecdotes as reliable evidence. Scientific follow-up consistently disproves these claims. These modern myths reflect a deep human desire to connect with our origins, a fascination that transcends biology and enters imagination. Ultimately, cultural myths about birth memory reveal more about human belief than biology. Across time and geography, societies have imagined, embellished, and celebrated remembering life's first moment. Yet science shows no conscious recollection is possible. These stories, while captivating, are narratives constructed by imagination, tradition, and social reinforcement, emphasizing our fascination with beginnings, even as the memory itself remains forever out of reach. The role of language in remembering. The very first experiences of life take place in a wordless world, where perception is raw and unformed. Infants can feel warmth, recognize voices, and respond to motion, yet they cannot translate these sensations into language. Cognitive scientists argue that language serves as a scaffold for memory, allowing events to be organized and later retrieved. Without words, the mind can sense, react, and learn, but it cannot record experiences in a form that survives the passage of time. Long before babies can form words, they begin to absorb the sounds and rhythms of the language around them. Studies by Patricia Kuhl showed that infants can distinguish subtle differences in phonemes from multiple languages by 6 months. This early exposure tunes the brain to speech patterns, laying the foundation for later communication. But it does not retroactively encode the feelings or events of the earliest months. The world is experienced intensely, yet it slips away without the framework language provides. Memory and language develop in tandem, but at different rates. While infants can recognize familiar faces or respond to touch, the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex areas, critical for long-term recall, remain immature. Pediatric neurologist Annette Karmeloff-Smith's research demonstrated that the brain prioritizes survival and immediate learning over storing unprocessed sensory data. Without language, events are experienced but cannot be cataloged, leaving a blank space where memory might otherwise exist. Although emotions may be registered before words are acquired, they too remain unrecorded. Newborns can feel distress, joy, or comfort, responding with crying, cooing, or movement. Jerome Kagan's studies suggested that early emotional reactions shape temperament, yet infants cannot attach meaning to them without verbal encoding. Language allows humans to label, compare, and remember feelings. Without it, the intensity of early emotion is fleeting, leaving only behavioral traces. Parental speech plays a critical role in shaping memory after the first year. Adults narrate events to toddlers, providing structure that the child can internalize. Children whose parents frequently describe daily events were more likely to recall experiences from age 2 onward. These recollections are guided by language, reinforcing the idea that memory is not simply formed by experience, but by the words that frame it. Subtle gestures and sounds infants produce are even linked to the emergence of language. Babbling, cooing, and imitating tones help establish neural circuits that will later support speech and memory. Repetition of sounds in social interaction strengthens brain networks, preparing infants to encode experiences once language becomes available. Memory and perception are intertwined with early communication, yet the earliest months remain inaccessible without words. Culture also shapes the role of language in remembering. In societies where storytelling is emphasized, parents and elders often recount events repeatedly, embedding them in narrative. Anthropologists noted that children frequently remember early events, though follow-up research indicated these were reconstructed from adult stories rather than true recollection. Language provides a bridge between experience and memory, relying on external reinforcement to take hold. Words, even the simplest, can hold the power to anchor experience. When a child learns labels for objects, actions, and emotions, the mind gains tools to encode, categorize, and later retrieve events. Toddlers who rapidly acquired vocabulary were also better able to remember described events. Without language, these experiences remain ephemeral, like sand slipping through fingers. Neurological studies suggest that language shapes memory. Areas of the brain responsible for speech and comprehension overlap with those used for recall, indicating that verbal encoding is essential for conscious memory formation. Experience without words engages the brain but leaves no lasting trace. Adults even rely on language to reconstruct early experiences, often imagining events they never actually recall. Freud suggested that people confabulate early memories when prompted by stories or photographs. Modern research confirms that language can create a convincing sense of memory where none existed. Social interaction amplifies this effect, as parents and caregivers constantly narrate the world to young children. Repeated storytelling enhances the child's ability to remember events, yet memories from before language mastery remain unreachable, reinforcing the principle that language is key to lasting recollection. Self-awareness is even mediated by language. As toddlers acquire pronouns, names, and concepts of time, they gain the ability to place themselves within events and organize experiences sequentially. Without linguistic structures, infants cannot form a coherent sense of personal history. The earliest months exist outside conscious memory, because the mind cannot translate perception into words. In the final analysis, language is far more than a way to communicate. It is the foundation upon which memory rests. Infants perceive, react, and learn, but until they can label and narrate experiences, those early months remain inaccessible. The first sensations of life are vivid and immediate, yet they fade into unremembered moments. A silent world experienced fully but recorded nowhere, until words make memory possible. Psychology of early amnesia. Early childhood is enveloped in a fog, a time when experiences are registered but not retained. Psychologists call this phenomenon infantile or early childhood amnesia, a universal feature of human development. In the 1970s, researchers like Carolyn Rovi Collier conducted experiments showing that babies as young as 3 months can learn to kick, to move a mobile, demonstrating memory in the moment, yet those memories fade within days or weeks. The mind is capable of learning, but the architecture needed for long-term recall has not yet formed. Memory formation depends on the maturation of brain structures, and in infants, critical areas like the hippocampus are still developing. Studies in Boston during the 1980s observed that while the hippocampus begins forming connections in the first months, these pathways are fragile and incomplete. Without fully established neural networks, experiences are encoded only transiently, leaving a gap where conscious recollection would normally exist. This explains why no one can remember the first months or even the day of birth. Emotional intensity does not guarantee memory retention. Infants can experience distress, pleasure, and curiosity in vivid ways, but psychologists have noted that these feelings are not stored for later reflection. Jerome Kagan's work in the 1970s emphasized that while early temperament is influenced by these emotional reactions, the recollection of individual events remains inaccessible. The brain records the physiological response, but the conscious memory is absent, leaving only traces that subtly shape later behavior. Environmental interactions shape learning, but rarely imprint lasting memory in early infancy. In the 1990s, studies at the University of Minnesota examined how infants respond to familiar versus unfamiliar caregivers, showing recognition without conscious recall. Memory requires both perception and the neural infrastructure to store it, which is still immature at this stage. Language, or the lack of it, also limits the ability to retain experiences. Without words, infants cannot label events, and the absence of verbal encoding prevents memory consolidation. Research by Patricia Kuhl in the late 1980s highlighted that language acquisition supports memory by providing a framework for organization and recall. Until words are internalized, experiences exist only in fleeting awareness, vivid in the moment, but inaccessible afterward. Stress hormones play a paradoxical role in early memory. Birth and early environmental stress elevate cortisol and adrenaline, which help the newborn adapt but interfere with long-term memory formation. The brain is wired to prioritize survival over remembrance, ensuring responsiveness but not reflection. Even repeated exposure to stimuli does not always create lasting memory. Carolyn Rovey Collier's 1990s research demonstrated that infants can learn to associate actions with outcomes, such as kicking to move a mobile, and they can retain this association for a short period. However, once neural connections weaken, the memory disappears. Cultural and familial storytelling can influence the perception of memory, even when real recollection is impossible. In the 1980s, studies observed that children frequently remember events from before age 3, after hearing repeated accounts from parents. These are not true memories but reconstructed narratives shaped by social reinforcement. Early amnesia ensures that these initial experiences exist only as external stories until the child's brain matures enough to form independent memory. Sleep patterns in infancy also impact the consolidation of memory. Infants spend much of their time in REM sleep, which supports neural development, but does not translate into lasting conscious recollection. Research in the early 2000s by Mark Blumberg showed that while REM activity stimulates brain growth and learning, it cannot preserve the specific events of early life. Memory remains functional in the short term, but absent in long-term consciousness. Physical milestones, such as rolling over or grasping objects, are remembered only as skill acquisition, not as narrative memory. The body remembers action and coordination, but the mind cannot retrieve the event as a memory. Even intense sensory experiences, such as being exposed to music or distinct smells, are fleeting in terms of recollection. Experiments in the 1990s showed that infants respond to familiar sounds and scents with measurable changes in heart rate or attention, yet these reactions are not stored in conscious memory. The gradual development of memory is a delicate process, dependent on both neural maturation and cognitive scaffolding. The first years are dominated by perception, reaction, and learning, while the capacity for reflection and conscious recollection emerges slowly. Early amnesia is not a flaw, but an inherent feature of development. allowing the infant to focus on survival and adaptation without burdening the immature brain with unretained information. Ultimately, the psychology of early amnesia reveals a striking truth. Humans experience life long before they can remember it. The brain records, adapts, and reacts, but conscious recollection only becomes possible once the structures for language, neural connectivity, and memory consolidation are in place. The earliest chapters of life exist as raw, unremembered experience, shaping behavior and emotion without ever entering the conscious mind. Traumatic exceptions. Some experiences leave marks deeper than the fragile memory systems of infancy can hold. Trauma in the first months can alter the developing brain, shaping responses long before a child can speak or consciously remember. Michael Blumberg, a pediatric neurologist in the 1990s, noted that stress during birth or shortly afterward can trigger lasting changes in the nervous system. These early impressions are stored not as memories but as physiological traces, influencing behavior and perception. The act of being born can itself be a traumatic event. Infants delivered after prolonged labor or emergency cesarean sections often show elevated stress responses, including higher heart rates and increased cortisol levels. Observations at Bellevue Hospital in New York during the 1980s revealed that these newborns remained unusually alert and reactive in the days that followed, demonstrating that intensity of experience is registered, even without conscious recall. Painful medical procedures imprint the body before the mind. Studies in the 1990s found that repeated heel pricks or injections caused heightened sensitivity and prolonged crying in newborns. Follow-up observations suggested that these responses influenced the way infants processed discomfort months later. Trauma imprints neural and emotional patterns, leaving traces in the brain's wiring that outlast any conscious awareness. Separation from a caregiver can create lasting physiological effects. Boston Children's Hospital researchers in the 1980s noted that infants temporarily removed from maternal contact displayed altered heart rate variability and elevated stress hormones. John Bowlby's attachment theory highlighted that early stress shapes emotional regulation and future social behavior, demonstrating that even without memory, the infant's body and brain register and adapt to these experiences. Oxygen deprivation during birth can produce similarly enduring effects. Infants who experienced hypoxic events showed exaggerated startle responses and heightened alertness in the weeks following delivery, as recorded in London neonatal wards in the late 1980s. The nervous system encodes these intense experiences, even though conscious recollection remains impossible. Neglect and inconsistent caregiving in infancy leave subtle but measurable imprints. Longitudinal studies in the 1990s observed that children exposed to irregular attention exhibited elevated cortisol and altered stress responses. While these children could not recount the experiences, the physiological imprint influenced temperament and vigilance, proving that trauma operates independently of narrative memory. Harsh or sudden sensory experiences can also produce lingering effects. Exposure to loud noises, bright lights, or abrupt movement in the first months of life often triggers prolonged startle responses and elevated arousal. Developmental studies from the 1980s found that these infants experienced shifts in sleep, attention, and responsiveness that could last for months, demonstrating that trauma can be encoded in neural patterns rather than conscious recollection. Unexpectedly intense, positive experiences may leave traces in a similar way. Some infants respond to overwhelming joy or excitement with heightened physiological activity, and research from the early 1990s suggested these neural patterns could influence later behavior. The intensity of sensation, whether distressing or stimulating, can register in the nervous system even if memory never forms. The influence of early trauma extends into personality and emotional development. Implicit memories stored in neural circuits and hormone regulation systems shape responses to stress, attachment, and learning. Studies in the 1980s emphasized that these unconscious imprints prepare children to navigate their environment, even though they cannot consciously recall the events that shaped them. Twins or siblings are also subjected to the same early trauma may show strikingly different outcomes. Research in the 1990s on twins temporarily separated from caregivers, highlighted variability in stress response, demonstrating that genetic factors and individual perception filter the way trauma is encoded. Memory is not required for these effects to persist. Supportive interventions can mitigate the impact of trauma, even when memory is absent. Hospitals in Canada during the 1980s observed that consistent touch, soothing, and responsive care reduced physiological stress markers in infants recovering from painful procedures. The nervous system can adapt and heal, proving that trauma's imprint is not irreversible. At their core, these traumatic instances demonstrate just how complex memory, perception, and development can be. Infants may never consciously recall the events that stress or overwhelm them, yet their nervous systems encode the intensity, shaping future behavior and emotional regulation. The earliest months of life may be unremembered, but their effects can ripple through personality, physiology, and experience for years to come. Memory reconstruction and false recall. The human mind has an extraordinary capacity to fill gaps in memory, sometimes creating vivid recollections that never actually occurred. Psychologists call this phenomenon false recall, and it is particularly relevant when it comes to early life experiences. Researchers like Elizabeth Loftus in the 1970s and 1980s demonstrated that memories could be influenced, distorted, or entirely fabricated by suggestion, leading adults to remember events that never happened. Unknowingly, parents often shape these early stories. Studies in the 1980s found that toddlers exposed to frequent parental narratives about their first steps or first words often claimed to remember them years later, despite lacking the cognitive capacity to encode or retain such memories at the time. Memory, it seems, is as much constructed as it is retrieved. Even subtle prompts can trigger the creation of false memories. In laboratory experiments, children and adults have been shown images or stories of events they never experienced, and many incorporate these suggestions into their recollections. What feels like a first-hand recollection is often a patchwork of imagination, suggestion, and cultural reinforcement. Trauma complicates the reconstruction process. When stressful or emotionally intense events occur, the mind may later attempt to reconstruct these experiences to make sense of fragmented sensations. Research from Boston University in the 1980s observed that adults sometimes create detailed narratives around their earliest experiences of fear, pain, or confusion, even when no conscious memory exists. Cultural influence can also direct the shape of false recall. In communities where storytelling about birth or early life is common, children absorb not only the facts, but the embellishments, metaphors, and interpretations adults provide. Anthropological studies in rural Japan in the 1980s noted that many children believed they could remember events described by parents or grandparents, though careful questioning revealed these recollections were entirely constructed. Photographs and home videos, even when considered concrete evidence, can contribute to false recall. Seeing images of one's infancy repeatedly can lead the brain to merge observation with imagination. Experiments conducted in the late 1980s showed that children who repeatedly viewed baby pictures often reported memories of actions they never performed, such as crawling down stairs or playing with a specific toy. False memories are shaped in large part by language. Descriptions, labels, and repeated phrases provide a framework for imagining past events. Studies by Patricia Bauer in the 1990s indicated that children who hear consistent narratives about early life develop detailed mental reconstructions that feel authentic. Family lore often fills the gaps left by early amnesia. Stories about birth, first steps, or early illness become a shared narrative that the child internalizes. Psychologists studying narrative memory in the 1980s emphasized that this blending of observation, storytelling, and imagination creates a powerful sense of recollection that is not grounded in the original experience. Sensory cues, even subtle ones, can support false recall. The smell of baby lotion, a particular blanket, or the sound of a lullaby can trigger imagined events associated with early life. Research from the early 1990s found that adults sometimes describe memories of infant experiences when presented with sensory triggers, even though those experiences predated their ability to form conscious memory. Emotional resonance strengthens the illusion of memory. Events that are recounted with heightened emotion are more likely to be believed as authentic by the child. In longitudinal studies in the 1980s, children whose parents described early life events with expressive detail were more likely to incorporate those accounts into their personal sense of history, demonstrating how the affective quality of narrative reinforces false recall. Minor inconsistencies in family stories, even small ones, can create new layers of reconstructed memory. Contradictions between what one parent says and what another recounts often lead children to imagine the middle ground as their own experience. Cognitive psychologists in the 1990s found that these blended recollections can be exceptionally vivid and enduring, showing that memory reconstruction is both dynamic and creative. Even adults remain susceptible to reconstructed memory, highlighting its lifelong impact. Early amnesia creates a vacuum that the mind eagerly fills, drawing from stories, photographs, and emotional cues. The brain integrates fragments, imagination, and social input into a coherent, but not always factual, personal history. The mind's extraordinary ability to craft continuity, where none exists, is revealed through memory reconstruction and false recall. Our earliest experiences, inaccessible through conscious memory, are reshaped into stories, images, and emotions that feel authentic. What we believe we remember may be a blend of imagination, suggestion, and narrative reinforcement, underscoring that memory is not merely a record of events, but a living, reconstructive process shaped by both the mind and the world around it. Birth and the subconscious mind. A newborn enters a world dominated by sensations, yet devoid of language or conscious comprehension, leaving the subconscious mind to absorb and interpret the torrent of stimuli. Even before infants can recognize themselves as separate beings, their brains are recording patterns, emotions, and reactions, storing them in ways that will later shape perception and behavior. Neuroscientists in the 1980s, including Mark Blumberg, observed that these early patterns influence how infants respond to stress, attachment, and novelty, long before they can form verbal memories. The subconscious acts as a silent recorder, capturing what the conscious mind cannot yet grasp. The birth process itself creates intense sensory and emotional impressions that are imprinted beneath awareness. Newborns exposed to prolonged labor, emergency cesarean sections, or difficult deliveries exhibit heightened physiological reactivity, including elevated heart rate, cortisol levels, and startle responses. Observations at Boston Children's Hospital in the late 1980s revealed that these infants remained unusually alert and sensitive for days afterward. Though they cannot consciously recall the experience, the subconscious mind stores these impressions, influencing emotional reactivity and behavioral patterns. Routine early life experiences, even the most ordinary, are registered in the subconscious. Simple interactions, like being held, soothed, or rocked, activate neural pathways that shape attachment, emotional regulation, and stress response. Psychologists such as John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth emphasize that consistent caregiving in the first months of life builds subconscious expectations about safety and trust. Painful procedures leave deep traces that bypass conscious memory entirely. Studies from the 1990s observed that repeated injections or heel pricks produced prolonged crying and physiological stress markers in infants, which could influence later sensitivity to discomfort. The subconscious retains the emotional and bodily response, even though the conscious mind cannot access the event. These early experiences show how trauma and intensity are recorded without forming explicit memories. The way experiences are emotionally colored plays a crucial role in their subconscious encoding. Infants respond not only to direct stimuli but to the feelings of caregivers around them. Research in London hospitals during the 1980s demonstrated that babies exposed to anxious or calm parental behaviors mirrored those emotional states physiologically. The subconscious mind absorbs these impressions, guiding responses to stress, social interaction, and attachment in ways that emerge later in life, often without conscious awareness. Sound, touch, and sight, the earliest sensory experiences, can leave lasting imprints. Newborns exposed to music, human voices, or distinct textures show measurable changes in neural activity and attention. Patricia Kuhl's work in the late 1980s revealed that infants could distinguish between different speech sounds, indicating that the brain is categorizing and storing sensory information subconsciously. Sleep is a powerful conduit for subconscious learning. Infants spend much of their early life in REM sleep, a phase during which the brain consolidates neural connections and processes experiences. Research in the early 2000s by Mark Blumberg and colleagues showed that REM activity strengthens neural networks that support later learning, attention, and emotion regulation. While no conscious memory is retained, the subconscious integrates these experiences, creating patterns that will later influence behavior and cognition. Attachment bonds are constructed in the hidden depths of the mind. When caregivers respond consistently to needs for warmth, feeding, and comfort, the infant's subconscious encodes expectations about reliability and safety. Studies of at-risk infants in the 1980s demonstrated that disrupted caregiving altered physiological and emotional responses in ways that persisted long after the event. Laughter, gentle play, and affectionate touch activate emotional and neural circuits that contribute to the formation of implicit memory. Observations in the 1990s suggested that these early joys influence temperament and social responsiveness, even if they cannot be consciously recalled. The subconscious mind selectively preserves experiences that carry emotional significance, leaving a lasting, invisible imprint. Early fear and stress responses illustrate the dual role of the subconscious in survival and learning. Infants exposed to sudden loud noises or other startling stimuli exhibit heightened heart rate and alertness, as documented in developmental studies in the 1980s. These reactions are not consciously remembered, but are encoded in neural patterns that guide vigilance, reaction to threat, and adaptation to environmental stressors later in life. Fleeting moments of comfort or distress, even brief ones, contribute to the formation of implicit memory. Pediatric research in the 1980s demonstrated that repeated exposure to gentle handling or mild stress-shaped infants' physiological responses in consistent ways, providing a foundation for later coping mechanisms. The unseen impact of birth and early experience on the subconscious mind ultimately reveals a hidden world of influence. Infants perceive and respond intensely to the environment, yet they lack the tools to form conscious memory. The subconscious archives sensations, emotions, and patterns, silently guiding behavior, perception, and personality as the child grows. The science of repressed origins. Life's first moments remain obscured in a fog beyond consciousness, yet researchers have sought to understand how they influence behavior. Neuroscientists have discovered that even before infants form language or self-awareness, their brains are actively recording sensations, emotions, and reactions in ways that bypass conscious memory. Research conducted in the 1980s at Harvard Medical School revealed that the hippocampus, which is critical for long-term memory, develops gradually, leaving much of early life inaccessible to conscious recall. Stressful or intense experiences at birth are particularly significant in shaping subconscious impressions. Newborns subjected to prolonged labor, emergency cesarean sections, or rapid medical interventions show heightened physiological responses, including elevated heart rate and cortisol levels. Observations at Boston Children's Hospital in 1987 indicated that these reactions persist for weeks, subtly influencing temperament and stress sensitivity. While these experiences cannot be consciously remembered, they are stored as patterns within the nervous system, creating a foundation for later behavior. Ordinary experiences in the first months of life register as lasting subconscious traces. Gentle touch, soothing voices, and rhythmic movements help establish neural pathways that influence emotional regulation and attachment. Psychologists such as John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth documented in the 1970s and 1980s how consistent caregiving shapes subconscious expectations of safety and trust. These patterns, invisible to conscious memory, guide social and emotional behavior long before language is acquired. Stimuli that are painful or overwhelming can register without ever entering memory, Studies from the 1990s showed that repeated injections or heel pricks triggered prolonged crying and measurable stress responses in infants. Follow-up observations indicated that these early experiences shaped sensitivity to discomfort and environmental stress months later. The subconscious mind records intensity rather than narrative, preserving the physiological and emotional imprint without forming explicit memories. Caregivers' emotional states play a profound role in shaping how infants encode experiences. Research in London hospitals in 1986 found that infants mirrored the stress or calmness of adults around them, with measurable changes in heart rate and alertness. The subconscious mind absorbs these impressions, creating lasting patterns that affect how children respond to emotional cues throughout development. Even without conscious recollection, these early influences shape temperament and social behavior. During the first months, sensory experiences play a key role in forming subconscious memories. Infants distinguish sounds, recognize voices, and respond to touch with remarkable specificity. Patricia Kuhl's research in the late 1980s demonstrated that early auditory experiences help organize neural circuits for language acquisition, illustrating that the brain encodes and categorizes stimuli well before conscious understanding is possible. These sensory imprints guide perception and learning later in life. Consolidating subconscious impressions is one of the key functions of sleep. Infants spend much of early life in REM sleep, during which neural networks are strengthened and experiences are processed. Studies in the early 2000s by Mark Blumberg and colleagues showed that this activity supports the development of attention, emotional regulation, and motor coordination. Although these processes occur outside of conscious awareness, they create patterns that influence behavior and perception in profound ways. Neural and physiological traces quietly preserve even attachment experiences. Infants whose caregivers respond consistently to needs for warmth and comfort develop implicit expectations of reliability and security. Research in the 1980s on at-risk infants revealed that disruptions in caregiving altered stress responses and emotional regulation, showing that the subconscious mind archives relational experiences before conscious memory emerges. Intense positive experiences, even when fleeting, leave their mark beneath awareness. Laughter, playful interaction, and affectionate touch activate emotional circuits that influence temperament and responsiveness. Observations from the 1990s suggested that these experiences create lasting impressions in the subconscious, shaping social behavior and emotional patterns long before children can articulate their memories. The interplay of stress, attachment, and sensory experience demonstrates that the earliest moments of life are not lost, but stored in the architecture of the brain. The hippocampus, amygdala, and other neural networks work together to encode intensity, emotion, and pattern, even when conscious memory cannot access them. Understanding this science of repressed origins reveals that our earliest experiences, though invisible to recollection, continue to guide thought, feeling, and behavior in ways that quietly shape the foundation of who we become.